Why do the most educated people in the world consistently end up on the wrong side of history? Not the ignorant ones, not the uneducated ones, the ones with degrees, the ones who read, the ones who consider themselves rational, informed, clear-thinking people. They're the ones who cheered loudest for the wars that destroyed their own countries. And here's the part that should disturb you. You may be doing the same thing right now and have absolutely no way of knowing it. A German pastor, sitting in a Nazi prison cell weeks before they hanged him, figured out exactly why. He said the greatest enemy of humanity is not evil. It's stupidity. His name was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He watched one of the most educated societies in the world willingly hand itself over to catastrophe. He asked, "How does an entire nation lose its mind?" His answer destroyed every assumption he had. Stupidity is a more dangerous enemy of the good than malice. Here's why that's not obvious. Evil, you can fight. Evil announces itself. It leaves people feeling uneasy, morally disturbed, instinctively resistant. Evil carries within itself the seeds of its own defeat. Stupidity? You cannot argue with it. Present it with facts. Those facts don't register. Push harder. It doesn't reconsider. It attacks. The most important line he wrote: "Stupidity is not an intellectual defect. It is a moral and sociological one." He didn't mean people were born this way. He meant stupidity is manufactured. Under the pressure of collective power, ordinary people voluntarily surrender their ability to think independently. The intellect doesn't break down. The independence does. And once that happens, they don't feel wrong. They feel righteous. Deeply, completely, sincerely righteous. They will defend the indefensible with genuine conviction. They will harm people they've never met and sleep soundly. The power of the one needs the stupidity of the other. You don't need a nation of evil people to commit atrocities. You only need a nation of people who have stopped thinking for themselves. Don't move this into the category of other people's problem just yet. Think about the last time a group formed a strong opinion around you, and you felt the pull. Not necessarily agreement, just the pull. The quiet cost of being the one who says, "I'm not sure that's right." Did you pay that cost? Or did you go quiet? That moment of chosen silence is not a small thing. It is the exact same mechanism at a smaller scale. The seed is identical. Only the consequences differ. Irving Janis spent years asking why rooms full of brilliant people make catastrophically stupid decisions. One case defined his answer: Iraq. The intelligence on weapons of mass destruction was shaped to fit a conclusion already reached at the top. Analysts who raised doubts were marginalized. The room produced unanimous confidence. The weapons didn't exist. Here's what happened inside that room, and inside every room like it. Everyone had doubts. But when you looked around and saw nothing but confidence on every face, the natural conclusion was, maybe I'm the one who's wrong. So you stayed quiet. And the person next to you, seeing your silence, reached the same conclusion and stayed quiet too. And the person next to them, around the entire table. A room full of people privately uncertain, each one performing certainty for the benefit of everyone else. That's the first thing groupthink does. It makes your doubt feel like a personal failure, rather than useful information. The second thing it does is subtler and more dangerous. The group starts to feel invincible. Not arrogant exactly. Something quieter. A shared, unspoken assumption that their collective judgment must be sound, their cause must be right, their plan must work. Warning signs get explained away. Contradicting information gets filtered out before it reaches the table. The group becomes a closed circuit, feeding its own confidence, sealed off from anything that might disturb it. Educated, experienced, well-intentioned, and walking collectively toward disaster. Each one privately uncertain, none willing to be the first to say so. Robert Sapolsky found part of the answer in the brain itself. We categorize people as us or them in under 100 milliseconds, before conscious thought, before language, before reasoning, based on the most superficial cues: an accent, a uniform, a symbol. Oxytocin. You know it as the love hormone, the bonding chemical released when you hold someone you trust. That same hormone measurably increases hostility toward the outgroup. The stronger your bond with your own people, the harsher your treatment of those outside it. Love and cruelty are not opposites in the human brain. They run on the same circuit. Loyalty, at scale, has always had a body count. And when leaders describe an enemy as vermin, as animals, as a plague, the brain activates its disgust response. The same neural reaction triggered by rot, by contamination. At that point, violence no longer requires hatred. It requires nothing more than hygiene. It never begins with the act. It always begins with the word. Think about how it actually happens. Not in history books. In real time. First, someone draws a line. Us and them. Two categories. Clearly labeled. Repeated so often, they start to feel like nature. Like the line was always there. Like it couldn't possibly be otherwise. Then the people on the other side stop being people. Not all at once. Gradually. They become a type. A category. They all think the same way. You can't trust any of them. You don't need to meet one to know what they're like. The category tells you everything. Then comes the language. Animals. Vermin. An infestation. A plague. And here's what most people don't realize. This language isn't just offensive. It's neurologically functional. The moment a human being is described as a disease, the brain stops processing them as a person and starts processing them as a threat to be eliminated. The disgust response fires. Empathy goes quiet. And then, the final step, the one that makes everything possible. Someone says, they brought this on themselves. 4 words. That's all it takes to dissolve the last remaining resistance. Not by force, by logic, by a narrative so internally consistent that guilt becomes irrational and violence becomes obvious. Every major conflict in human history has followed this sequence. Not some of them, all of them. What changes is only how fast the ladder gets climbed. All of it. The sociology, the psychology, the neuroscience points to the same place. Carl Jung spent his life mapping what he called the shadow. Not evil, but everything we refuse to acknowledge about ourselves. The anger we've buried. The fear we perform confidence over. The capacity for cruelty we are absolutely certain belongs only to other kinds of people. His central finding: we do not destroy what we cannot accept about ourselves. We project it. We find a container for it and pour into that container everything we are unwilling to examine in ourselves. Think about the group you find most threatening right now, the political side you most distrust, the ideology that angers you most. Now ask yourself an honest question, not about them, but about you. What is it specifically that you cannot tolerate? That intensity, that specific heat of your reaction is not just information about them. It is a map of something unexamined in you. This doesn't mean the threat isn't real. It means the war out there and the war in here are running on the same fuel. Jung said, we never fight our real opponent. We fight a figure we've constructed, assembled from our own repressed material, projected outward, given a face and a flag. This is why wars so rarely solve the problems they claim to solve, because the problem was never entirely out there to begin with. Bonhoeffer saw it as a sociological law. Janus saw it in boardrooms. Sapolsky saw it in neurons that fire before thought begins. Jung saw it in the mirror. Wars begin in the minds of men, not in the minds of monsters. In the minds of ordinary people who stopped questioning, who chose the warmth of collective certainty over the discomfort of individual doubt, who let the ladder climb beneath their feet, one rung at a time, until what was once unthinkable became not just acceptable, but righteous. So the next time you watch a nation move toward conflict, don't ask who the enemy is. Ask what the people have been made afraid of. Ask what shadow they've been handed. Ask who benefits from their stopped thinking. Because the war out there almost always starts with a war in here. And the most dangerous thing any of us can do, in any room, at any scale, under any collective pressure, is go quiet when we know something is wrong. That silence is where it begins. Can you remember a moment when you went along with something? A political narrative, a collective outrage, a social consensus that you privately weren't sure about? A moment when you chose silence over honesty, belonging over truth? If you can, you understand this better than most people ever will. Tell me about it in the comments.